Hello, I'm Robert Emmett Kernan. I'm head of Blue Stack Productions, the publisher of Irish Environment, an online magazine covering environmental matters on the island of Ireland. I'm very happy today to be here in Kyoto, Japan, talking with Aileen Smith. Aileen, how are you?
Okay, I'm fine.
It's good. I met Aileen first in 2003. I'm back again. Aileen is the executive director of Green Action, a nuclear power organization here in Japan, and is also the advisor to the steering committee for the Mayors for Nuclear Free Japan.
Yes.
And I thought we would ask Aileen, what's the status currently of nuclear power in Japan? And that question has to start with what happened at Fukushima.
Okay.
So could you tell the audience just in general terms what the event was that happened at Fukushima?
Okay. The Fukushima nuclear power plant accident started on March 11th, 2011, when the great earthquake hit Japan. And meltdowns occurred at the nuclear power plant site. And well over 100,000 people had to evacuate. And it was really a huge nuclear power plant disaster. And we've been suffering from the aftermath ever since then.
Well, it was the tsunami that blew out the cooling functions at the plant?
Yes, a huge tsunami blew out the cooling functions of the plant. But there's evidence that actually the earthquake that hit just before that actually started the accident. And there's still research being done about that. And currently, I mean, it's going to take decades and decades and decades to clean out the plant.
Yeah.
And now there are just tanks all over the site with contaminated radioactive water.
And there are no plans at this point what to do with all that waste.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Now, and how many people were evacuated as a result of the event?
Well over 100,000 people had to leave, and still tens of thousands are still not returned. And in 2017, in April of that year, many of the areas that had been restricted, where people could not live, they were de-restricted, so to speak, and the local authority says now you can go back. That's really not good for people because the areas are still contaminated. But once it's declared okay to return, you then become a voluntary evacuee, which means you lose the subsidies, you lose the government support, you lose housing support, etc., and it becomes very difficult financially. And there's you get a fee if you return, and so it's just really hard on people. And so many people, you can imagine, you're living in Fukushima, maybe you've bought a home, you have to pay the loan, and you had to evacuate, you still have to pay the loan, right? And then now if your area is declared okay to return, you have to continue paying the loan. But if you don't want to be contaminated, you live outside and you have to find a place to live, and keep living somewhere else.
And now, how large an area was it, Aileen, that was evacuated?
Large swathes of Fukushima prefecture were designated restricted. But what's really important to tell people is that Fukushima is one prefecture, but there are other prefectures adjacent that were quite contaminated, and people had to evacuate from those areas too. So it's not just Fukushima. And the other thing I think that the world needs to know is that at a certain point when the accident was going on, they were worried that the spent fuel pools would go, which means incredible amounts of contaminated material that would break open and would get released into the environment. That would be really dangerous because one nuclear power plant reactor operating for 1 year creates about 1,000 times the Hiroshima radioactive material. And so you had many reactors there that were operating, and each year they created that much waste, and there's years of that stored. So if that went, there were analyses between the U.S. government and Japan that said that up to 250-kilometer radius might have to be evacuated. And so the then Prime Minister Khan was actually having to contemplate evacuating parts of Tokyo. And so anybody listening to this thinks, oh, well, there's no nuclear power in my country, or it's this, I don't know, well over 100 kilometers away, I mean, you may still, you never know. If a nuclear, like, spent fuel pool goes, it just is just absolutely disastrous.
And now, do we have a sense of what kind of injuries or risks there were from the people as a result, whether there's cancer risks associated with the event?
Well, first of all, it's very difficult to be able to connect, your contamination, your exposure to, like, cancer many years down the line. So that's very difficult. But now we clearly know that the one of the first cancers that appear early on is thyroid cancer, and there is an increase of thyroid cancer. And the other thing that I think that's really important to tell people about radiation is that children are affected many more times than adults, and females are affected many more times than adults. So, for example, a young baby girl, and for example, a 6-year-old male, one cancer for the 6-year-old male would be 10 cancers, 10 children, little girls would be affected. So it's very much an issue about protecting young people and about protecting women. And really about protecting everybody, because now so many people are going in there to decontaminate, and so there's just thousands and thousands of workers that are being contaminated, a majority of them being male, and many of them not that old.
And the thyroid cancer, was that primarily in children as it was in Chernobyl?
That's just, for example, the fact that children are much more susceptible to radiation. Right. Yes. Right. So this is so unfair, because the people that weren't involved in any decision making or in a society that made that decision about nuclear power are the ones that are being affected by it.
Now, Aileen, what was, before the event, please, what was the status of nuclear power in Japan? What was the scope of it within the power system?
Japan was dependent on 1/3 of its electricity on nuclear. And actually, the day the Fukushima nuclear accident happened, what really saved Japan, economically, is the fact that there had been opposition to building of nuclear power plants all over Japan, from the northernmost island of Hokkaido to the southernmost the island of Kyushu. Way down Okinawa, there were never nuclear power plants planned there. There was opposition. And by local farmers and fisher folk and citizens in general, even the cities and unions. And because of that absolutely strong opposition, we didn't depend on nuclear power in a greater way, because Japan really wanted to go the route of France. And so it could have been dependent 70-80% of its electricity on nuclear had they had their way. But because of that persistent civil society opposition, we were dependent 1/3 on nuclear power, electricity, but not the remaining part.
And what was the effect of the event in terms of the public opinion about nuclear energy in Japan afterwards, immediately afterwards?
Of course, completely changed after the accident. Other nuclear power plants had to be shut down because you had to make sure that they're all safe to operate. And so there were blackouts, and when you have a blackout in a major city like Tokyo, then real change had to happen. It was really crunch time, having to save energy. And actually there was a plus side to that, in that a huge metropolitan area like Tokyo is like never before in history was a huge metropolitan area able to reduce its electricity consumption so fast. And that was a real hardship, especially on people that need mobility, that's escalators and elevators, and it was a real hardship. But as a result, factories become much more efficient, and a lot of people feel it finally, it was really hard, but overhead went down kind of permanently afterwards, because of that crunch that had occurred. And that's an incredible phenomena that happened in Japan after the accident.
Now, they shut down all the nuclear power plants initially, didn't they?
After the Fukushima accident, the ones that were shut down were not restarted. And then gradually, of course, all the reactors were going into inspection. And so we had nearly 2 years of all reactors shut in Japan. So for that period of time, there was zero nuclear power electricity in Japan, and we were fine. We were okay. Of course, the problem is that because we depended so much on nuclear and our renewables program was just absolutely behind, just minimal, the crunch was taken over by coal-fired plants and restarting or using all of that capacity that was available. So that was certainly, not good for our CO2 emissions. It increased our CO2 emissions. But that's only not because we didn't have nuclear power, but because we had depended on these big reactors, nuclear and fossil, and had not advanced in renewables, that we had that problem. Japan today is only dependent on 2.7%, under 3% of its electricity on nuclear. And the renewables has gone way up, it's well beyond, it's like 10% and rising, whereas nuclear is just sort of sitting there and really still really hard to restart nuclear reactors. After the Fukushima nuclear power plant accident occurred, there was much more opposition to nuclear power, and the majority of people have opposed restart. And still, it's just a clear majority to want to end nuclear power in Japan.
Even now?
Yeah, even now. But the breakdown comes on going cold turkey and stopping immediately or stopping, after a while. So there's debate about that, but it's very clear that Japan wants to end nuclear power and as quickly as possible. Japan's denuclearized faster than Germany. Really fast, but that's not because of policy, because our basic energy plan still says that in 2030 we should be dependent 20 to 20% on nuclear power. It's like a ridiculous piece of paper. It's not going to be able to be implemented, which is really bad because you have on paper something that can't be implemented, which means that you don't do your homework on other issues, like really being more serious about renewables. Just because there's this piece of paper that says, okay, 2030, we're going to have, our goal is 20 to 22% of our electricity is going to be nuclear. And that's not a way to make energy policy in Japan. And I think that that's going to be a real Achilles heel for Japan's society and economy to not really create a good energy plan. And nuclear is very much preventing us from having a good energy plan.
Yeah, well, let me, if maybe we can finish with that kind of follow up on that issue, and that is that there's the argument both certainly throughout Europe and here that nuclear has to be part of the mix because it's carbon zero or low carbon, and we need that. And some will say, well, maybe we need to get rid of it eventually, but it should be a transition fuel, like natural gas is sometimes thought of until renewable comes forward. What's your feeling on that whole argument?
Okay, first of all, nuclear is not CO2 free, and mining uranium costs energy and creates CO2, and the tendency now is as it gets more difficult to mine uranium, the CO2 output does increase. Obviously, nuclear is just usually compared, when you talk about global warming, to fossil fuel. Well, fossil fuel is horrible as far as the amount of CO2 is created. Nuclear is much better compared to coal, but look, compared to renewables, it's like now efficiency in renewables is going up and up and up, whereas efficiency in nuclear is not, and the costs are going up and up and up with nuclear. And the fact that nuclear is terrible for working on climate change is that it blocks, the nuclear lobby would block, for example, in Japan, it blocks the transmission lines. We want to save it for this nuclear reactor. So even if you create a renewable energy company and you're doing good work, you can't get your product to the customer because the transmission lines are being hogged by the nuclear reactors. And the cost of building new nuclear is just rising. There's this huge opportunity cost. The amount of amount of low carbon energy you can make with that money, you take away from that good effort and put it into nuclear, and it's like this huge opportunity lost in creating really much cleaner energy, or in conservation or efficiency plans. And if you spend money on that, you can reduce CO2 much better than trying to build a new nuclear power plant.
Is that argument, your argument, catching on within the population at large in Japan, you think?
No, it's like, these kind of false claims. It sounds really good, like a nuclear reactor is operating. It's not burning, fossil fuels there.
Yeah.
It's clean energy. And you just look at that and people think, well, we do have this climate crisis, and so is nuclear a necessary evil? People are conned into believing that, whereas actually the best thing you can do in moving forward and working on climate issues is to end nuclear, because it keeps you in that old large, big, costly framework.
Well, we know we have you, at least, to be making that counter argument here in Japan, and we wish you the best of luck on that, and thanks for talking with us today.
Okay, thank you.